Hello everyone, and welcome to our Blue Tech Innovation Night at Virtual Venture Café, and a special welcome to our first-time community members. My name is Hannah Iskowitz. I am the intern here at Venture Café, and thank you so much for being here. So before we get started, we'd like to thank SeaAhead for their sponsorship of this event. These partnerships are what enable us to bring you this content. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Jennifer Bender. Jennifer Bender is the lead professor in Environmental Innovation Clinic at UMass Boston. She's an experienced professor in higher education industry, and her consulting focuses on environmental innovation and solution-based integrated problem solving. So that being said, I cannot think of anyone better to lead that topic. Take it away, Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our afternoon panel on exploring innovation in aquaculture. But what we're really going to do for the next hour is set the stage for what innovation will and could look like as we move forward in this kind of exciting and exploding field, certainly nationally. We have 4 amazing panelists, and we're going to take some time at the front end of this hour to have each of them introduce themselves, to talk about the specific work that they do, and then in particular talk about the context that they do that work in relationship to innovation. Then we're going to set the stage with some policy and regulatory conversations, and then move forward into specific innovation areas. And of course, all the time during this hour, being mindful of the relationship between aquaculture and the pressures from increasing issues regarding climate change. So I'm going to start the hour with introducing Sebastian Bell, who is the executive director of the Maine Aquaculture Association, and he will take it from here and talk about all the work that he's been doing recently and leading up to now.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I run a farmers trade association in the state of Maine. And just by way of background, spent 25 years being a commercial farmer, spent a few years being a regulatory guy in government, and spent a few years working at the New England Aquarium on a research and development project around bluefin tuna. What I want to talk to you today about is 2 things. One is you're going to hear a lot about research and development in aquaculture space, and if there's one thing I leave you with today, it would be we've got to put the D back in the R&D. The United States is way behind other countries with respect to commercialization. We're very good at technology development, we're very good at research, and other countries are very good at commercializing that research and that technology in the aquaculture space. We are playing catch up. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So this is the kind of the state of the situation in the United States as of 2017. This is the last year we have current national data for. And you can see that we have quite a diverse industry. And although we are the 3rd largest market for seafood in the world, we are the 17th largest aquaculture producer in the globe. So we are behind from a production point of view. Does not mean that there is not American capital invested in aquaculture. There's actually very significant amounts of American capital invested in aquaculture, but they tend to be invested in places overseas. As an example, one of the majority shareholders in the largest salmon farming company in the world is an American group of investors that are investing in salmon farming, but they're not doing it here in the US, they're doing it in other countries. So if you look at aquaculture as a sector in our country, and you look at the average annual growth rate over the last 20 years, globally, aquaculture has been growing at roughly 8% annually globally. And in the US, it's been averaging over the 20-year period roughly 1%. And indeed, in recent years, it's actually been contracting, not expanding on a national basis. And that's driven largely by the contraction in the catfish sector, which is the largest production sector nationally. There are parts of the national sector which are expanding, and I'll talk briefly about that in a little bit. This is a comparison of the basically different proteins in the marketplace, and you can see that most of the seafood and aquaculture protein that is consumed in this country is not domestically produced. From a farmer's perspective, I look at that, and although that is frustrating for me, it also presents opportunity. It's a place where we can improve our domestic production and displace some of those imports, as long as we can do it at a competitively priced level. Kelly alluded to this earlier. You know, we have the largest exclusive economic zone in the world, and it does present some tremendous opportunities for expansion in the offshore environment. We also have, and I think Don will talk about this, we have some real potential for expansion in land-based production as well. But a lot of people focus, when they start to talk about economic development, they focus on the regulatory climate and investor confidence. And the point I want to make here is that we've spent a lot of time focusing in this country on research, and we spent a lot of time debating regulations. But actually, regulations is a relatively small part of the development cycle. If you look at how companies are built and sectors are grown. And so this is why I think we really need to shift our focus nationally away from the regulatory and research focus and more towards the economic development side of the house. And you will see in the next year an initiative at the federal level where all the federal agencies which are have some degree of jurisdiction over aquaculture, whether they are land-based or ocean-based, will come together and begin the development of a national aquaculture economic development plan. And that's really first time it's happened in this country. Many of other countries, many of the places that I've worked in my career have had those national economic development plans for many years, places like Norway, Ireland, Japan, certainly parts of the Southeast Asia. And they have used those economic development plans to focus their limited resources and develop the sector in a very systematic and premeditated way. So on the right-hand side, you see all the kind of general categories that are ingredients into an economic development initiative, understanding that you need to have the regulations solved and in place in order to be able to capitalize on the right-hand side of the equation. The two big things that have happened in the United States from a regulatory or a policy point of view in the last few years is we've had an executive order under the current administration which has prioritized aquaculture development, and two pieces went into that executive order. Nationally, the National Aquaculture Association, which is a group that I sit on the board of, we lobbied very hard for that EO. And then there were some foundational pieces of work done by the Department of Commerce prior to that with respect to looking at research priorities and streamlining the regulatory climate for aquaculture. There are really three components to an economic development program. Obviously, the business climate, market demand has to be there, and then the available resources that you bring to bear on that economic development plan. Those break out into a lot of subgroups and a lot of more complicated pieces, but the countries which are being successful in aquaculture development have programs in each of these areas that are well resourced, that are in many cases public-private partnerships, and they have champions in the government who are pushing for those programs in order for them to make a difference in terms of the economic climate, so that people can take risk, investors can have confidence, and grow the sector by investing in companies. So I'm going to stop here and just say that there are some examples of success, and I'm glad to say that Maine is one of them. If you look at our annual growth rate over the last 20 years in Maine, we have averaged 7% per year in the aquaculture sector. We have a very diverse aquaculture sector. We've got shellfish, finfish, and seaweed. We've got land-based, we've got ocean-based. We have new technologies. We have well-established technologies. Probably the things that we have identified in our part of the world as being areas where innovation and opportunity occur are things like the use of AI in automating husbandry and remote sensing and offshore facilities, Aquatic animal health is an area that's growing very fast. The goods and services sector for aquaculture is growing actually faster than the production sector. Production sector, as I said, is growing about 8% annually. Goods and services at a global level is averaging around 11.5%, 12% per year. So goods and services are catching up, and that's largely due to the young nature of our sector. And then product development and distribution. So in the seaweed sector, I'm sure you will hear about the need for product development there. And things like blockchain in the distribution world are going to revolutionize the seaweed sector. The seaweed sector's distribution chains and business structures are really quite archaic by modern standards, and some of the technologies that will come in to there will certainly revolutionize it. The one thing I will close with, and this was, I sat on a panel this morning with a bunch of Norwegian colleagues, and one of my panel co-presenters was somebody who analyzes protein markets, and fascinating presentation, precision fermentation. Remember those two words. The prediction coming out of this analyst was the precision fermentation is going to revolutionize the way food is created. In my world, we're looking at precision fermentation for feed ingredients, but this analyst was suggesting that by the year 2025 or 2030, half of the world's cattle inventory would be unnecessary because of precision fermentation and protein creation fermentation. Quite a revolutionary, disruptive technology, one that has tremendous potential in our sector in terms of feeds and aquatic animal health, but in the food sector in general, may actually really change what we eat and how we eat it, and whether we need to farm it or whether we need to ferment it to create it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sebastian. I know there's a lot of really great questions in the chat right now, but we're already running a smidge behind. So I'm going to ask Paul Dobbins to introduce himself next. And there are some questions about regulatory being an obstacle for investors, and hopefully we'll cover some of that as we move through this hour. So Paul, I'm going to give it to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for your participation in this. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, and I see some new faces, and we'll be looking forward to meeting you as well. I am the Senior Director for Impact Investing at the World Wildlife Fund. Impact Investing is a new activity for our US office. World Wildlife Fund has offices in 100 countries around the world. We are very active in aquaculture. We have over 50 of our program managers and associates spread out around the world, working on various aspects of aquaculture, from the traceability that Sebastian mentioned to looking at feeds, certifications, how can we stop conversion of mangrove forests for shrimp, a whole breadth of opportunity out there. The reason that we're focused on aquaculture, and we sit within the food silo, if you will, of World Wildlife Fund, not the ocean silo, is that it is looked at as a means to provide highly nutritious food source with minimal inputs going forward into the future. And we want to help shape that future and advance it. My project has that word right in it. I am tasked with advancing aquaculture for climate change. I'm funded by generous support from the Grantham Family Foundation and through the Business Initiative, which is a Walton Family Foundation initiative. And we are focused on seaweed and shellfish aquaculture, specifically for the environmental services that it can provide, the highly nutritious biomass and feedstocks that it can create with minimal inputs, and for the jobs that it can create in coastal communities as means to diversify revenue streams for fishing families. We've spent the last 2 years doing a landscape scan around the world. We visited 23 countries that participate in seaweed and shellfish aquaculture, looking for opportunities for innovation, principally around scale. How do we scale this up in an environmentally friendly way that takes into account our concerns about marine mammal entanglement, species diversification, and other impacts to the environment. And what has been interesting about that scan is that many of the challenges that face us here in the US have been addressed by other nations. And some nations are somewhere between where we are in the US, as Sebastian pointed out, many times we're behind the curve. And we can use those insights gained from those nations that are not as developed as some of the premier nations in aquatic farming, but more developed in the US as kind of a roadmap to how we can move forward. We've identified 3 barriers for advancement of aquaculture. Social license, we've heard a lot about that, and we'll hear more about that as the panel goes on. Markets, so product development and expansion of markets. 3 markets that we're looking at are seaweed for livestock feed, biorefining seaweed for proteins, and for as a feedstock for biodegradable bioplastics. And we're also, through our landscape scan, have determined that early stage capital is really difficult for many of these innovative companies to come by. They can make it into the friends and family, but then that leap from friends and family out into the venture world is very difficult for them to take, principally because there are not a lot of performance metrics that investment funds can use to judge the risk versus the opportunity with these early stage companies. And so we have recently made our first investment in an early stage company. It is Ocean Rainforest. The founder and CEO, Oliver Gregerson, will be speaking at 4. We invested in Ocean Rainforest because of the novel technologies that they're developing for farm design in offshore environments, and they're located in the Faroes, a very difficult environment, and also for their market. So they sell into the animal feed market with a novel product that is really making a difference for pig farmers. And so I won't steal Oliver's thunder, but he can talk about that when he gets on stage. And so I'll stop here. Hopefully we'll catch up a little bit on the time, because I think the conversation going forward is going to be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Mark, actually I haven't seen you today, but I'm sure you're here. If you could
I should be online, and it tells me that my camera is on, so I hope that you guys can see me.
Yes, we do.
I'm a little bit in an outdoor environment, and so I hope that the wind does not whistle too much into my microphone.
Great.
So,
Mark, if you could just take about 5 minutes to introduce yourself, and then we'll pick back up in the broader context of our conversation today, that would be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Happy to do that, and welcome everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. My name is Mark van Keitz. I'm with ARPA-E. ARPA-E, to those who don't know it, it's the Advanced Research Project Agency Energy. So we are based in the U.S. Department of Energy and are charged with supporting research and development efforts that are really long-ranging in the space of the whole energy arena. So I'm sorry, there's a little frog in my throat. So what I have been doing, at ARPA-E as a program director, we're charged with developing new funding areas that really can be transformational and open up new spaces. And what I've been focusing on for the last 5 years is the development of a program called Marina, which is focused on developing new tools to bring seaweed cultivation to a scale that ultimately can be relevant for energy. So we are really looking at it as an additional biomass source that allows you to grow it in a quantity that we can really offset fossil CO2 emissions. And while we have learned and even seen a lot in Asia that there's a very significant industry right now, it's still needs to grow by nearly 2 orders of magnitude to play on an energy scale. So the program is all about developing the next stage technologies, and it coincided very well with the nascent seaweed aquaculture industry in the US. And we have so far invested a little bit over $50 million in this space across about 20 different projects, and really looking at all the different aspects. So it's really not just looking at cultivation systems, but also at tools to help model the design of new cultivation systems, of harvesting systems, opportunities, novel opportunities to monitor the progress of a farm using unmanned underwater vehicles, to equip with sonar and cameras to really see what's happening on the farm underground, because from a farmer's perspective, it's really hard to see what's going on unless you put on a diving gear. And so this is a very critical tool. And finally, if you go into an agronomy space, it's a lot about the plant and plant varieties that you are growing. And we have probably 5,000 years of catch up to do relative to terrestrial agriculture. And so we are funding also some projects that help us better understand advanced breeding technologies to increase yield in this space. So at the same time, what's really important to us as well is not just purely looking at the technology development, but helping the groups and the technologies really move into the market space. Because for us, our goal is to have an impact in the real world. And the only way that we can do that is by translating and transferring these technologies that we're supporting on the development stage into actual businesses. And in that context, I can only echo what Paul said earlier, is the importance of really developing markets that are allowing farmers to sell their product. And another element, I think we get to talk to that about that later, is that we need to process the material into desirable products. And just in the interest of time, I leave it at that, and happy to take questions along the way.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to turn to Don Perkins next. And I do want to tell folks that are on the call that some of the questions that are coming in, if you can cover them maybe in some of the context of your talks. One is just about who the major producers are in the US at this point in time, and are some of the more traditional producers, typically for wild fish, I believe they meant, wild caught fish, are they transitioning or diversifying into aquaculture? And Don, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Don, you are on mute right now.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Don Perkins. I serve as president and CEO of the Gulf of Maine Research Institute in Portland, Maine. We're an independent 501c3 marine research institute. We're a highly entrepreneurial entity. We have an unusual mix of an interdisciplinary research team, a technology-enabled education team, a community group that works at the local community, state, interstate, federal, and high seas scales. And as of a couple of years ago, a business development capability run by our Chief Ventures Officer, Blaine Grimes, who is on the call today, and I think you'll hear from this afternoon. So our job is to pioneer collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges, bringing those capabilities to focus on complicated questions. We're focused on two things relative to this conversation. On the heels of 20 years of reducing our commercial fishery harvests, how do we grow our seafood capacity here in New England? And that's really about increasing the value of wild fisheries and increasing the production in farm fisheries. We also are on the forefront of climate change research. As many of you know, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than most of the world's ocean. And so we're really on the bleeding edge of the question of, how do you support traditional fisheries transitioning into being climate resilient? And what's the future for communities that have a long history of being rooted in the sea? I want to just give you a flavor, a very local flavor of some of the issues that are at play today. So this is the coast of Maine. It's about 300 miles long as the crow flies. It's about 3,000 miles long if you were to stretch it out. So we have this extraordinary variegated coastline. You'll see the different color dots here. The green ones are oysters. The purple ones are seaweed. The blue ones down east in a different region are salmon. The purple diamonds are mussels. These handful of blue diamonds are RAS, two of them salmon, one of them yellowtail, and one of them American eels. And then we have a smattering, but increasing number of seaweed farms along the coast. So message here is that we're navigating a really complicated set of wickets, markets, the demand of capital for a return on their investment in an industry that has a long gestation period with capital in the water at risk, the challenge of social license, the emerging challenge of equity, and then the climate challenges of acidification, temperature increases, and sea level rise. So it's a brutal kind of landscape or seascape that we have to navigate. And I would note here that while there's a lot of kind of interesting and intellectually kind of intriguing technology issues, it really starts with finding support in communities to develop facilities, whether they're on land or on water, doing so across a diversity, in our case, of bays and estuaries and communities, across a diversity of species. And it's in that diversity that we'll find resilience over time. Monoculture of anything, as we know, is a real challenge. And so we're focused on, how do we support that diversity? And so when you hear a debate between, salmon at sea or salmon on land, or small aquaculture versus large aquaculture, that's not the point. The point is we need to be supporting the evolution of a diverse aquaculture ecosystem wherever we're interested in aquaculture. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Don. So I think I was going to kind of shift the intent for the next section of this talk a little bit. Sebastian is going to talk about policy and regulatory in context of laying the groundwork and foundation for investors to invest in aquaculture. And then I'm going to move aquaculture's place in a resilient food system and supply chain at the end. And I think it'll just be a equally robust conversation, but more streamlined, if that's okay. So Sebastian, I'm going to put you on the spot for about policy and regulatory in like 7 minutes. Is that possible?
Absolutely, no worries. It boils down to a couple of very simple things. Regulatory stability and predictability from an investor's point of view is really one of the most important things. There's a lot of uncertainty in aquaculture around environmental variance, around technologies, around markets. But if you layer on top of that uncertainty and instability in the regulatory arena, it makes it very difficult for people to risk capital. And so I think if you look at the places in the world that where there has been growth in the sector, and where there has also been innovation in the sector, you will often find places where there has been regulatory stability and predictability. That varies in the United States from state to state. We are, I think, lucky in Maine in that we have worked very hard over about a 45-year period to not have an unchanging regulatory environment, but to have a regulatory environment that is kind of based on common sense and the protection of the public trust, the environment, but is also a process that is somewhat predictable in terms of if you go into it and you match up to the criteria that are very clearly articulated, then you will likely get your licenses and your leases. There are other places in the country where that has not been the case, and they have not seen the level of growth that we have seen here in Maine. At a federal level, we have, there we go. At a federal level, we have been less stable and predictable, and there has been an on again, off again debate about who should be the lead agency from a policy point of view, what the relationship is between agencies that have regulatory responsibility versus agencies that may have economic development responsibility. So we have, in the marine environment at least, we have often been caught between the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Commerce, NOAA Fisheries. One of the challenges we have in this country is that, in particular, NOAA Fisheries is really a resource management and protection agency. And so they have a hard time, they have had a hard time, I would say up until relatively recently, getting their head around the fact that the aquaculture sector is really is not resource limited in the sense of the biological stock that you are growing and putting on the market. So it's not about managing fish stocks per se. And NOAA has had a hard time kind of getting their head around that. Department of Ag has a long history with the freshwater folks. They come at it from an agricultural farming perspective. They have been less challenged, I think. And if you look at the areas in aquaculture at a national level where we have probably made some progress from a regulatory point of view, from a policy point of view, many of them are areas that the Department of Agriculture has responsibility for. As an example, we now have in this country a set of risk management tools that most terrestrial farmers have access to, but aquaculturists have never had access to. When you think about a crop cycle that might be anywhere from 6 months to 4 years, the ability to bed hedge and manage risk, whether it's environmental risk, whether it's disease risk, whether it's financial risk, is a really important tool to have. And up until relatively recently, we have not had that. USDA has moved quite effectively in the last, I would say, 5 years to bring those tools to bear for the aquaculture sector in a very encouraging way. We have the Aquaculture Act, which is a pending piece of legislation in the Senate and now the House, trying to clarify the regulatory climate for offshore aquaculture. That's aquaculture that occurs in federal waters. NOAA Fisheries tried to move some offshore projects forward through a permitting process under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is the act that they use to regulate wild fisheries. That was challenged in court and they lost the challenge. And so the response from the agency's perspective and from the industry's perspective was to try to go back to Congress and get those authorities clarified. There is some debate over the specifics in that bill. And I would say there's some disagreement within the industry in terms of what those specifics should be. But that legislation is certainly out there moving forward and is helping facilitate a national discussion about what the regulatory requirements would be for aquaculture in the offshore space. If you look overseas at where some of the largest investments and biggest innovations are occurring on the production side of the house, certainly offshore aquaculture is one of those areas where there's really been some quite revolutionary developments in the last even 3 to 5 years. So it's an area I hope that it gets clarified from a policy point of view at a national level. And then we will need this national economic development plan to give the investment community the resources and the tools they need to have the confidence to invest in aquaculture development in the federal waters. And I'll stop there.
Great, Sebastian, you did get a question that's totally relevant right now, is that how long will it take NOAA to organize permitting once the Aqua Act is passed? And I'm going to add a little comma parentheses, if the Aquaculture Act is passed.
So it's a great question. We don't know the answer to that. The executive order has pushed federal agencies in a number of different ways to try and streamline permitting and identify so-called aquaculture opportunity zones. NOAA has identified 2 of them, and although they will not inherently necessarily speed up permitting, they will allow for a lot of the environmental base work that needs to be done before a permit is issued to be done prior to the actual permit application. So there's some positive things there. The frustrating, I think, thing from the private sector's perspective is this is not rocket science. All we need is a way to get into the federal waters that provides us as investors some security of tenure of that permit. So whether it's a permit or a lease, there has to be some security of tenure which is legally defensible based on, in many cases, prior case law and property law, so that you know if you're going to make a $100 million investment, you have some security of tenure to that permit or that lease.
Great. I'm going to turn it back over to Dawn. We're going to talk about social license. And Sebastian, if you read Matt Thompson's comment in the chat, that'll be helpful for your piece on conflicts under social license. So,
okay.
Great. Thank you.
So social license, can you hear me okay, Jennifer?
Yes.
Yeah. So social licenses is, in essence, the permission of a community, the blessing of a community for, some economic activity to go on, in this case, aquaculture. And it's something that some entities are incredibly nuanced and thoughtful about, and others are oblivious about. At a very simple level, I remember 20 years ago, Sebastian saying to me, if a mussel or oyster farmer takes the time to walk around the cove where they want to do a lease and knock on everybody's door and shake their hand and look them in the eye, they're likely to get those people on board with them. And if they forget to do that, or they're not comfortable doing that, they're going to have a struggle. And there are equity issues in that reality. There are also just common sense issues in that reality. And so this is a serious matter. Strategically, over the last couple of years, as many of you know, we've had 3 very significant recirculating aquaculture system proposals advanced here in Maine. 2 salmon, one called Whole Oceans in Bucksport on a abandoned paper mill site. They went into an industrial town that had lost its industry, and they got their social license with no public opposition. Just down the road, 25 miles or up the road, a company called Nordic Aqua Farms went into the town of Belfast, and they have been through a brutal permitting process with a small but well-funded opposition. And it's been a very painful, costly process. I think they will ultimately get their social license. The question will be whether they get worn down in the process. And there's an important issue of picking your town. And I think we have a positive story evolving further down east in Jonesport, which is an isolated fishing town that has been selected by a company called Kingfish Zealand, Danish company, to develop a yellowtail production facility, RAS facility, and they've gone in there very kind of graciously and quietly, and so far the community is welcoming them, as a source of jobs and taxes. So, this is one part a company taking the time to really figure out the communities along the coast where they want to locate. It's a second part picking the community with local advice about which communities are likely to be hospitable or not. And then it's one part the unexpected. People can show up from out of town, from out of state, from out of country to politicize a project for one reason or another. And so these risks, from the investor point of view, these are risks that you have to take note of. and oftentimes are not well appreciated because investors haven't lived through these if they're coming from outside the industry. So I guess the last thing I would say is that the common sense in this is if you're looking at an aquaculture business and thinking about the social license risk, the key question is, I think, is has that business taken the time to identify the mix of friendly and unfriendly stakeholders and really taken the time to reach out to them quietly in advance? If they have, they probably have a chance of navigating this issue. If they haven't, they will get caught. So with that, Jennifer, I'll turn it back to you.
Mark, if you could talk about social license in context of national kind of, I want to say, environment, what that feels like right now, that would be great, and kind of where we are and maybe where we need to go.
Yeah. First, let me put the disclaimer in that ARPA-E is not a regulatory agency. So we are an R&D funding agency. So we are not involved in any regulatory processes. We are more dealing with regulatory issues on the back end, in the sense that the teams that we are funding have to get their permits in order to start the work in the ocean. And in that context, but also with a sight towards the importance that we only have an impact if this can grow sufficiently, we have, right at the beginning of the program, looked very closely at the need to pay a lot of attention to social license. So one of the ways how we have done that is we have been involved with NOAA very closely, and we have engaged them on one level with regard to the marine spatial planning efforts, because that's really, I think, one of the first steps just to better understand the ocean neighborhood. That is really something that I think is the first thing. What else is happening there? And that is a first screen for potential conflicts, and then understanding that. The second one, I think, is that we are to some extent still struggling with, because it's so new that people don't really know how this is going to look like. Particularly in our case, we oftentimes have just very small designs, and people are most concerned about unknowns, or when you don't have a clear image what something could be, because then these ideas or this vacuum gets filled with certain projections that may or may not be anywhere close to reality. And so I think the communications part is very, very important of when you look much further in the future, how things could look in 10, 20 years. And so it's an ongoing effort. Once again, we are trying as part of, we're bringing all our teams together on an annual basis, but also are bringing in members of the various stakeholder communities. And I think that's really critical for R&D efforts in this space. And I think that's where we operate the most. Once again, we're not a regulatory agency. We are trying to reach out to there's an interagency algal working group in the federal government, where we are looking at coordinating a lot of information. And I think it's just a long process, but I just wanted to reiterate the importance to think about social license early on. It's not something that you try to get at the very end as a last step of your process, but you have to pay attention to it from the very beginning.
Thank you. Great. Paul, you're next for the international piece of this conversation, and then we'll move right into Sebastian to talk briefly about conflicts.
Sure. So social license is an area that we've identified as a barrier and an opportunity for advancement of seaweed and shellfish aquaculture. And I'll use an example where it's working well, with the caveat that no matter where you go in the world, existing use conflicts are present, environmentalists are concerned, and there seems to be frustration, no matter what entrepreneur you talk to, at the speed of permitting and regulation. And as Sebastian correctly pointed out, the length of that permit, because that is very important to attracting investment. And an example I'll use is New Zealand. We've spoken to people at various levels in New Zealand, from the federal government to municipalities and down to the farmers. And this is a story that you hear, and it shows what can be done when there's alignment. So existing use conflicts still exist in New Zealand. It's still very much an ongoing discussion, but they dwarf the US in terms of marine aquaculture production. And when you talk to the Minister of Agriculture in New Zealand, you hear that aquatic farming is really important to their agrarian nation from a strategic standpoint. And then when you talk to a regional government official, they will say aquatic farming is really important from a strategic standpoint for their region. And it goes down with almost everyone agreeing that it is strategically important for their nation to participate in aquatic farming. In fact, the Archdeacon of the Anglican Church of New Zealand, who is also a Maori elder, will say that it's important culturally so that their people can continue to work on the water, and it's important for economic development. So there's an alignment that it is important. There are still very hard discussions around, well, how are we going to execute this? Where is it going to be executed? What's appropriate? And in what fashion? And this is not unique just to New Zealand. You see this in other countries that have developed their aquaculture industries. Over time, the various stakeholders have come into line with an agreement that it's important. And I think that's the key, is really to have everyone on at least the same page of, okay, this is an important thing to discuss. And you see support for it from the federal level, the regional level, and down to what could be considered the state level. Another example is Korea. So for Korea, what I find interesting is that they have research support and development support for their aquaculture industries because they are strategic at the federal and at the province, and then right at the municipal level. So you see municipalities supporting the aquaculture industry with research facilities to develop different strains that are going to provide greater yield, temperature tolerance, and disease resistance. You see that their work rolling up into regional facilities, and regional facility work rolling up into national facilities. Again, there's an alignment on the importance of aquaculture or aquatic farming to their communities and to the economic security of the nation. So I think, for me, what I am very encouraged by is seeing the federal government come out with, or at least attempt to come out with greater cohesion around federal regulation. I see it happening at the state level. I see it happening for towns that have a say in regulation in aquatic farming. I see it happening at that level too. And then I'm sitting in Massachusetts, and a former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, had a saying about politics: all politics is local. I would reiterate Don's point. All aquatic farming, all activity on the ocean is local. It comes right down to the bay, and you need alignment within that bay to make it happen. One of the things that we're doing to show that we believe this is really an important sector is through our direct investing in for-profit companies. We're making equity investments. We're using funds from the World Wildlife Fund to invest in seaweed farm, in this case, as a start, to signal to stakeholders that we feel this is really, really important to the future for our food security and for the environment.
Thank you, Paul. Sebastian, we'll bounce it back to you to talk about some conflicts, and then hopefully we'll have about 10-ish minutes to talk about supply chain and aquaculture in relationship to the food system and climate change.
Sure. So, and I want to just reinforce one thing that Paul just said, which is this idea that a country or a community recognizes that it is in their interest to help support the emergence of sustainable food production techniques, whether it's aquaculture or something else. I think that is really critical. And if you look at when I first went to Norway many, many years ago, the Norwegian government prioritized salmon farming as a rural economic development tool. Why did they do that? Because the North Sea herring stocks had collapsed, and coastal agriculture, sheep farming in Norway, was unable to compete with the subsidized sheep farming from places like New Zealand and the EU. So they made a conscious decision as a country to use aquaculture as an economic development tool in rural communities. And it was really a national project for them as a country. In terms of conflicts, there are lots of different potential conflicts out there. I will start by just saying, never forget, and this is, I think, a measure of the fact that the aquaculture sector has begun to mature. Never forget that there are people and institutions out there who benefit from conflict being prolonged or magnified. There are people in the aquaculture policy world that if the problems are solved with respect to conflict around aquaculture, then they don't have a reason to be in the sector anymore, or a job, basically. So I say that not because I've been in this sector for a long time and probably am a little cynical about it, but because I have witnessed it firsthand. And when you're in a situation like that, it is very difficult to negotiate your way around that, or to come up with solutions if people have an inherent financial interest to prolonging conflict. Having said that, I am a huge optimist on any conflicts, whether it's an environmental conflict, whether it's a social conflict, whether it's some sort of a technical conflict. One of the things I think which is most interesting and exciting and most fun about being in the aquaculture sector is we are optimists by nature. Farmers have to be optimistic. Next year is always going to be a better year. We are always looking to come up with a better solution, a better widget, a better way of farming or solving an environmental problem or what have you. If you look at the technical innovation which has occurred in aquaculture in 30 or 40 years, it is really quite revolutionary. And I have great faith that we will be able to solve those kinds of conflict. Now, Matt from New England Aquarium identified one conflict as being a conflict between entanglement and marine mammals and in the offshore federal waters. And no question that is a risk. And we need to focus on that and bring our science and our engineering to bear to reduce that risk. It is something that I think is eminently solvable, and it will take teamwork. It will take teamwork both from the environmental community as well as the growing community, as well as probably government agencies to come up with innovative solutions to try and solve that problem. You know, obviously the right whale issue is front and center for New England, particularly for the lobster sector. And they are going to have to come up with solutions as well. So if the lobster industry can come up with solutions for half-inch vertical lines in the water, I am completely and utterly convinced that the aquaculture sector will be able to come up with solutions for raft-based or net pen-based or longline-based technologies for aquaculture. I think it's eminently doable.
Thank you, Sebastian. So let's move to the last section of this hour. We'll stay on an extra like 5 minutes, I think, so that we can really try and sum all this up in context. And so it's the full panel at this time. And if we could talk about aquaculture's place in a resilient food system to start, and then supply chain, I think, is a really relevant topic right now. So if we could kind of cover those two elements in the next 5 minutes, that would be great. And so I'll ask Paul to kick it off.
Sure, I'll be quiet and quick because I have a pile driver out in the water in front of me that the guy is actually holding off on the button. So I'll just throw out a couple of statistics that illustrate the great potential for aquatic farming. I'll use seaweed as the example. If you look at the trajectories of potato production and yield globally, and its historical growth rate and its projected growth rate, and you look at the seaweed farm production per year, its historical growth rate and projected growth rate, seaweed will eclipse potatoes, which is the 4th largest terrestrial crop, by 2051. If we can accelerate the rate of growth of the seaweed industry from an average of 8% to 12%, we will double the production compared to potatoes by 2050. There's tremendous opportunity out there, and we'll do so without using any arable land, freshwater fertilizers, or pesticides. And we'll put people in coastal communities to work. So I'll just leave it at that as some of the great opportunity out there for innovation and investment, and as Sebastian has correctly pointed out, heavy D.
Thank you. And also just folks, if we can kind of focus on the innovation side of supply chain, that would be really helpful as we kind of move into the rest of the afternoon. I can call on Don.
Yeah, so obviously this pandemic has been a brutal lesson in supply chain. The seafood industry shut down in mid-March, both locally and nationally. There's been tremendous development in retail because people have been cooking at home. There's been tremendous effort to go direct to consumer, and as we see, food security becoming an increasing concern in this country. We're not an aquaculture nation, but when we start to worry about pandemics, when we start to worry about other, terrorism as a threat, which we've been spared from substantially from a global point of view, the question of local food production and local market mechanisms is, I think, going to become an area of breakthrough potential. And so the question there is, how do you provide those mechanisms at scale, because they're very expensive from a marketing point of view. The people tend to focus on the technology, but it's really about the marketing. So I think this is a wildly dynamic time in terms of localizing our supply chain at scale. And the people that figure out how to do that are going to be extremely well positioned for the uncertainties ahead.
Thank you. And on to Mark. Not Mark Wang, sorry. Although it looks like we might have lost him. Possibly. Okay, Sebastian. I'm going to call on you.
I just want to reinforce what Don said. I think, seafood distribution channels, as I said earlier, up until COVID, really, if you compare it to other food commodities or protein groups, were woefully primitive. And it's very clear. I mean, the shifts that have occurred in the seafood sector in a relatively short period of time as a result of COVID have really been quite amazing. And when you add into that some of the technologies with respect to traceability and telling the story of the farmer at the local level, and adding that to the marketing piece, it's a very, very interesting and, as Don says, dynamic part of the value chain. The other, I think, area which we're going to see a lot of progress on is packaging and product form. Seafood has historically been a scary protein source to a lot of people because of how you have to deal with it and the product forms it comes in. And if we're really going to compete with the chicken and the beef and the plant proteins of the world, we have to really innovate in that space and up our game so that we are number one, competitive from a price point of view, but also competitive from a convenience and product quality point of view.
Thank you. And Mark.
Yeah, I want to move away a little bit from the more finfish and even shellfish markets, because they have pretty clearly established customer profiles and they're established products in many ways. There's a lot of things that might be needed, but in the seaweed space, it's really a different story. So it's, at least in the US, it's not something, it's more of an exotic food. So there's a tremendous need for the development of new products where you can integrate the seaweed qualities. And so that's one thing that we have actually seen even just in the 5 years. And I want to particularly highlight Alaska, which has grown tremendously in these last 5 years with their ability to produce. They have a very supportive regulatory environment there. And we are getting to a point that we really have to ask, is there enough market? So there's this dance between market development and production technology development. And you can't have one without the other. And so I think that is much more pronounced than in the finfish or in the shellfish realm. And I think that's where we need tremendous amount of innovation. People that understand the unique qualities and properties of seaweed and turn that into innovative products that are compatible with our marketplaces. And this is in the human food, but then also going further into the animal feed space. That's, I think, an absolute requirement for this industry on the seaweed side to continue to grow.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to actually turn it over to Mark Wang to kind of wrap things up for us. But before I do that, I would like to ask the panelists if they don't mind sharing their email in the chat. That would be great. Several people have asked for your contact info. And aside from the fact that I gave them all your phone numbers, I figured maybe the email would be great. I'm just kidding, by the way. So just your emails, if you don't mind sharing, would be terrific. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark right now.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, everybody, for a very engaging session on the future of aquaculture. Jen, and thank you for moderating. You know, as a guy that has a marine engineering clean tech background, so I don't have anything really to add on the prior discussions. So I'll just conclude maybe from SeaAhead's perspective on where we view the role of innovation. And yeah, my background has historically been starting in clean tech over 20 years ago, and also having tracked the food and ag space. And just to reemphasize the points I made earlier, it's interesting what happens with traditional siloed industries. If you look at its case studies, utilities 25 years ago, the big three, big food, right? And so maybe there's some commonality about maybe where those sectors are today. One is, you know, we've talked about social license, definitely, and barriers where there's incumbents that make money on the way that the system is. So they definitely could be a barrier and dig their heels in. Or just don't want to do anything differently. There is some case studies in those three examples where the market went around it, right? And that could be something as big as disruption. I don't think the big three saw Tesla coming, or necessarily the hotel space saw Airbnb coming, right? Those are extreme examples of unicorns. But you know, the point is that we think that there is some similar trends coming. There's a lot of technology innovation. You do have these new group of innovators that historically don't know the water. They need that social license. They need to work with the local farmers. They're interested in working with the local farmers. And they're like, can we help? And as opposed to maybe necessarily arm waving and we're gonna save you all. But it's literally what we see in our hub, particularly before COVID, when we were able to get together. We see anything from 22-year-olds who say, here's what I read about what's happening underwater. I don't necessarily want to work for Facebook. Could I bring my programming coding skills to see if I can help and be part of this, because I find it challenging and I like what they're doing because they're local in my community. Or we see 40-something-year-olds who are on their third career saying the same thing. I read about the right whale. This is an intractable issue. I live in Gloucester. I got friends who are being impacted by the right whale. I'm an environmentalist, and we don't want the right whale to be extinct on our watch. So I wonder if I can use data analytics and come up with an outcome. So anyway, so I'll conclude there to the next session is thank you everybody for jumping in. And we really look forward to working together as a community on the next steps of the future of aquaculture, where innovation plays a big role. Sorry for my 6-year-old.
Thank everyone very much for
Thank you.
participating. Thanks, Don, Sebastian, Mark, and I think and few Marks, and I think Paul might have jumped.
Thanks all.
Anyway,
Thanks.
thank you guys.
Okay, thank you so
All right.
much.
Thank
And
you, everyone.
okay,